Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Clara speaking. This is part 2 of the video which I did yesterday as to the sexual education within the school's curriculum in New Zealand. And remember, people, this is happening worldwide. This is not just in New Zealand. So it all collaborates and is manipulated to actually be in line with UN Agenda 2030, and Ardern actually implemented that non-binding UN agreement into our domestic policies, making it binding legislation, took it from a soft law to a hard legislation, which is not necessarily lawful. Remember that, people. So no, it doesn't require a voting or anything. It's just accepted as being part of the law or legal system of New Zealand. I won't say law because I don't see it personally as lawful. It cannot be lawful to groom and sexually abuse children within the education system. And that's how I personally see it. So this was brought about under the mask of what they called studies, surveys as into anti-bullying. And they entrenched all this sexuality stuff within that. So a lot of this was done prior to 2015 to collaborate with UN Agenda 2030, which was introduced in 2015. So it was deliberate. So in those questions and responses to students, we had personal, sensitive, natured questions around sexuality, relationships, actions, sexual desires, preferential sexual partners, girl, 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 boy, girl, girl, and it went on, and bisexual and transsexual, and it went on and on and on. And all of this was superimposed into the anti-bullying surveys that took place internationally, nationally, and this was all designed by the UN. So the discrimination part they brought in about that was dress, colour of skin, all this critical race theory stuff, and that was then aligned and manipulated into UN Agenda 2030. So it could be used directly and indirectly in the Global Development Goals, SDGs. So achieve gender equality, for instance, SDG 3, leave no one behind. So those no one left behind could be the LGBTQ. Do you get that? So, what we've got here is the RSC programs were included in school curriculums worldwide, as I've explained. And the UN designed programs were named Monitoring School Violence Based on Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, or Gender Expression in National and International Surveys. That's how it was described in March 2019 in the technical brief. But as these surveys were taking place, they were actually taking place as the focus being namely on anti-school bullying and discrimination, but entrenched with all this sexuality stuff. So the UNESP, UN is a UN global agency that collaborates with UN member state authorities, leaders. UNESCP led the UN Agenda 2030 SDG for Education 2020 to 2030 with ambitious goals and commitments they were determined to achieve. So with education promoting a global movement based on sexuality and relationships, which they called monitoring school violence. And the core being it was deliberate. the core being was based on sexuality, gender identity, gender expression under the name SOGIE, SOGIE. You might wonder what that is, and that's what that is about. So it is estimated that 245 million boys and girls experience school violence. That was UNESCO UN 2017 report. UN included all forms of school violence as a barrier to achieving UN Agenda 2030 development goals worldwide. So target non-violent, inclusive, effective learning environments for all being transgender as well, where they hyper-inflated transgenderism and played down heterosexuality in these surveys. So that all forms of violence are seen as a barrier. So there you go. And that's inclusive, effective learning environment for all. And that's how they describe it. Gender expression, gender non-conformance, girls characterized as masculine, boys categorized as effeminate, became information that was embedded in the school violence bullying surveys. So the 2020 to 2030 agenda SDGs saying that they would not succeed without the UN Global Education Framework strategy, which include the capturing of sensitive sexual data from students at regional, global and national levels. Data on SOGIE, S-O-G-I-E, transgender, genderqueer, etc., etc. So many of those countries found that such studies could be costly, unreliable, unsustainable. Therefore, UN member nations governments managed the studies because they had the power over what evolved from academic research, like Crown Research, all the research coming out of Massey University, Auckland University, etc. And this is where all this transgender shit came from in the first place, academia worldwide. So if data was recorded and was collected by universities, academia, NGOs, that it supported, promoted LGBTQ people, individuals, communities. And that's what it was for. The UN Global Education 2030 Agenda, UNESCO, led the way at a national, regional, global level to implement their ambitious global goals for what is called the Best Practice for Global Education 2020 to 2030. So this was school violence, physical, psychological, sexual, bullying inside and outside the classroom, offline, online. Quoted all forms of violence as achieving UN Agenda 2030, including hyper-inflating that of transgenderism, LGBTQ1. So these studies and surveys were adapted, manipulated to fit directly or indirectly the global development goals of UN Agenda 2030. Approaches, questions, responses from students on certain sexual fantasies, same attraction, the classification of multiple genders, sexual attraction being sexual behaviours and desirabilities. Frequency they had sexual contact, female trans, defining the answers as in, like, for example, sexual kissing, sexual touching, oral, genitalia, anal, etc. What do they consider themselves to be sexually, gender, etc. These questions were all in the anti-bullying international, national survey studies that were designed by the UN. So, for example, Auckland University research was named Youth 2000 School Survey. The sample size was 28,000 students and was conducted in 2001, 2008 and 2012. And it included 9 to 13-year-olds included were references to Pacifica cultures, Marian languages, and terms for gender diversity, genderqueer in those cultural languages. So they also referenced the CDC school-based survey, global population adolescents aged 13 to 17 years old. Sample size was unknown and the frequency was in 2018. In Australia, for example, Intersex Human Rights Australia recommended using non-binary options such as X or non-binary rather than intersex in survey questions about a student's sex and gender. And that was Intersex Human Rights Australia 2012, prior to UN Agenda 2030. Australian Commonwealth Government Guidelines on the recognition of sex and gender 2013, approaches that gave recognition to non-binary, gender identity, and sex characteristics. So again, examples were they used for discrimination as sexual jokes, comments, or gestures, and linked that all to SOGI as a specific form of bullying. So this related to students' perceived gender nonconformity, particularly boys who could be seen as effeminate. Other studies stated that young children were unsure about what they were attracted to sexually, but they still dug into that. So interrogation. So collecting data on intersex students, due to the very small number of students who were intersex, it was highly challenging to collect meaningful data on school violence affecting such children in large surveys. The term queer, a reclaimed word, was an umbrella term for a range of sexual identities, as in Queering Schools in New Zealand in 2011, which is documented, including LGBT or gender questioning queer, interrogating sexual gender. Survey on a small member of Canadian Forces, the institutionalised population of children aged 12 to 17 that were living in foster care and persons living in 2 health regions of Quebec. And now this is all referenced in this technical brief of the UN Round Global Education Surveys and Studies of March 2019, what I have just said to you. So the 25th of May 2019, the World Health Assembly updated the 21st century gender incongruence that's reflecting of critical advances in science and medicine, previously termed as not a gender identity disorder, described a marked incongruence between individuals that experienced, expressed gender and then assigned sex in prepubertal children before they became teenagers, that stage. So incongruence, what does that mean? Incongruence. Well, it's a lack of consistency or inappropriateness that affects the subject evaluated in situations that are in odds with the terms of reality. It doesn't fit into reality. So the national UN-defined population-based study surveys were deliberately designed, implemented into UN Global Education 2020 to 2030. And these were orchestrated, implemented by policymakers worldwide governments, as the now relationship sexuality programs we see in schools today in New Zealand that we're all talking about, which I believe is grooming, sexually abusing children within the education system. So the UN that all referring to the UN March 2019 technical brief, where it refers to each individual school student's physical features relating to sex, including genitalia, chromosomes, hormones, physical features, gender identity, different from the sex attributed to them at birth, was well documented as part of the research, the study material. So everyone in society will suffer from this. Children deliberately being robbed of their childhood innocence, their magical childhood years, pushed into a world of instability. Children are the most vulnerable. They hurt the most when they have been sexually abused and used, groomed. It has far-reaching effects that affects how they feel about themselves. Self-shame isolates children. Some will be more introvert, some more extrovert. It brings about huge problems. So people wake up, speak up. Now, this is number 2 of my video on this. I will go further into a number 3 because I want to talk more about how this is going to affect our children. Please share this. Wake up, New Zealand.